Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Brennan with the Notre Dame Alumni Association. Thanks for joining us for the latest edition of ND Conversations, one of our online learning series offered through My Notre Dame. Today's topic is a timely one. Yesterday, the United States Senate held hearings into the state of collegiate athletics, and several senators had very pointed questions for NCAA President Mark Emmert. We'll be exploring today, thanks to the expertise of three members of the Notre Dame family, the issues of the state of the intercollegiate athletics experience and the future of college athletics. Before we get to I introduce our panelists and get to their presentations, I want to explain to those of you watching at home how today is going to work. Each panelist will walk us through a brief presentation. Afterwards, we'll take your questions. In the meantime, you can submit your questions using the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You can start submitting the questions now and do so throughout today's programs, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Our three panelists today are all graduates of the University of Notre Dame and current employees of the university. Each one possesses a distinct and valuable area of expertise that's relevant to today's discussion. First, we have Professor Brian Levey. Brian joined the Mendoza College of Business faculty in 2007 after a 20-year legal career. At Mendoza, he teaches the introductory undergraduate business law course, as well as several ethics classes in the undergraduate, graduate, and executive programs. Brian is a recipient of the Edmund P. Joyce CSC Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. Prior to returning to the university, Brian served as Fannie Mae's Vice President for Ethics. In addition to his extensive experience as an ethics officer for various businesses and organizations, Brian also has been in private law practice and served as an adjunct professor at George Mason University, George Washington University, and Northern Virginia Community College. Brian is a member of Notre Dame's class of 1984, and he earned his law degree from Catholic University and a Master's of Law from George Washington University. We also have with us today Jill Bodensteiner. Jill is the Senior Associate Athletics Director at Notre Dame. She oversees the areas of compliance, policy, risk management, and legal affairs for the athletic department. Prior to joining athletics, she spent 12 years working in the university's general counsel's office, where she served as the university's primary contact, as the university's primary contact for legal issues in the areas of employment, athletics, and international studies. Before returning to the university, Jill worked as an associate at two law firms specializing in employment litigation. She graduated from Notre Dame in 1991 and earned her law degree from Washington University. She also earned an MBA from the Mendoza College of Business here at Notre Dame in 2008. Finally, we have Adam Sargent. Adam is the Associate Director of Academic Services for Student Athletes at the University of Notre Dame. His main responsibility is to provide academic counseling to the members of the university's football team, a role he has held for the past 8 years. Adam has worked in academic services at the university for 15 years, and over that time has served as the academic counselor for the hockey, women's basketball, baseball, men's and women's lacrosse, men's and women's swimming, and women's golf teams. Adam is a 1999 graduate of Notre Dame. As an undergraduate, he played for the Notre Dame lacrosse team. After graduating from Notre Dame, he completed a Master's of Science in Education, focusing on mental health counseling at Indiana University at South Bend. During that time, Adam interned for 2 years at St. Joseph's Hospital, where he trained as a therapist. Adam is going to kick off the presentations today, and with that, Adam, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you. Well, today I want to talk a little bit about the issues surrounding academic engagement for student athletes at the universities around the country. One of the first ways that I can give a background as to how this issue of academic engagement has been addressed really in the most recent decade is to talk about the introduction of the APR, right? And that is the academic progress rate. In 2004, the NCAA recognized the issue surrounding high-profile student athletes lacking in progress towards a meaningful education. They were not graduating, and they were competing and generating revenue for the institutions. Part of what they chose to implement was the APR, and that is a real-time measure of both eligibility and retention of scholarship student athletes. The idea behind the APR has been to level the playing field and make sure that there has been accountability both at the institutions and in the athletic programs, to ensure that student athletes are in fact making better progress towards their degree. The APR, without getting into too much detail as to how it quantifies progress towards a degree, is designed to ensure that during the academic year, in both semesters, student athletes are completing a minimum number of credits, and over their course of competition, that they're making progress towards a degree in percentages that would align with graduation at the end of a 5-year career. One of the things that I think is important to talk about with the APR is to look at the intent and then how it's played out over the last 10 years. Obviously, the intent when measuring academic eligibility and retention is to hope that the student athletes are engaging in a meaningful way at their university communities and receiving an education that will prepare them for life after college. I think if you look around the country and you take an assessment as to how it is playing out, there probably are groups that would rightfully question if the retention and eligibility points always equate to a meaningful education. Most of the institutions around the country choose to use the minimum requirements. For example, the minimum requirement for receiving an eligibility point would be completing a minimum of 6 credit hours in a semester. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily what people should be striving for. If you complete that minimum 6 credit hours, in the following semester, in order to maintain eligibility, you will have to complete more credits, finish with 12 credits complete for a total of 18 during that year. The idea here is to ensure that you are, in fact, engaged in the institution. Whether or not the completion of an eligibility point and a retention point equates to a meaningful education is up for debate. What we've seen are programs that maybe have an overrepresentation of student athletes in particular majors that might not result in true academic engagement, or at least in rigor that will help them develop the skills that they need for life after college. There is a penalty process that can be implemented if programs are not making good progress. Now, this is something that I don't want to get into all the details of, but we saw it play out recently at a place like the University of Connecticut. Their men's basketball program was ruled ineligible for postseason competition because the program was not meeting the minimum guidelines in the APR. In response to that, there was an article that was released over the past year that cited the university taking action. And one of the actions that they chose to do was to shift their academic services program from the provost office to the athletic department. I think for many people who work in the field of academic services for student athletes, that is a curious decision to make. One of the reasons that I think Notre Dame has had such success with their graduation and education of student athletes is because our office, Academic Services for Student Athletes, is in fact autonomous from the athletic department. We work for the provost office, and that allows us to have the ability to advocate exclusively for the student's academic best interest. For a program to make a decision to shift it from the provost office to the athletic department, to ensure that they are meeting the minimum guidelines that would allow them to continue to compete in the postseason, I think is an interesting decision, and it kind of highlights how what drives this may not necessarily be an authentic engagement of their student athletes more than it is meeting the minimum criteria for the measures in place in the APR to ensure that you have students competing. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but it's an interesting piece that a year after they were ruled ineligible to compete in the postseason, they won the NCAA championship. And I think that's one case that is worth looking at in terms of how there may be a contrast between meeting those minimum requirements and true engagement. Switch. All right, so a meaningful engagement, or a meaningful education versus eligibility and retention. In an ideal world, you would think those two things equate. When I think of a meaningful education, one of the things that we stress at the University of Notre Dame is making sure that there is growth, a sense of autonomy, developing skills that will definitively help them in the professional world after they leave the university, but also developing a sense of independence. In terms of how that equates to eligibility and retention, I think it's important to consider really what the programs, the majors, and the institution are providing. When you look at how majors are distributed over an athletic team, it might be one way in which you can take into consideration whether or not those student athletes are in fact meaningfully engaging in the university's community and receiving the education that we are charged to provide for them. I think it's critical, if we're going to provide proper compensation, equity in this exchange, especially for student athletes that are generating significant amounts of revenue for the institution, we want to ensure that it's not just eligibility and retention, that these students are in fact receiving the type of experience that will help them grow and develop the skills that they need to graduate and contribute meaningfully in the professional world. To ensure that, I think it's important that we provide them with a total atmosphere that will allow for those skill development. If you can move to the next slide, it'd be great. One of the questions I think we want to look at to ensure that, one, the institution is challenging the students to not only remain eligible, but really evaluate whether or not they're developing skills, decision-making behaviors that will translate to success in the professional world, is to consider really from the start, who are we inviting to that campus? So here are some questions I think are relevant to look at. One, does the student have the ability for academic success at whatever university they're going to attend? Bringing the right population is critical. And one of the things that we want to take into consideration is, although it's great to provide student athletes with an opportunity that they may not have had otherwise without their sport, we want to make sure that we're bringing the right population to institutions and that they have the ability to compete with the students at that institution. We've seen very visible and very painful experiences at institutions where there are integrity breaches, and there are examples of experiences that run counter to what that institution is trying to do to educate. Part of that may be because they're inviting students to come to that institution that do not have the ability to compete and contribute with the other students at that campus. Two, is the student interested in getting a college education? One of the things that we really want to take into consideration, and I think a good question to look at, is if the student was not playing their sport, would they still choose to come to college? One of the pieces that you want to look at is, as much as it's great to provide a student access to an institution that they may not have had access to otherwise, because it can empower them and it can develop a wonderful set of skills that they might not have had otherwise, is, are they oriented towards getting an education? Or is this primarily about athletic competition? If a student's not interested in getting that education, we're going to have issues on that campus, no matter how much support you provide them, no matter how much appropriate resources you have. It's impossible for that student to get a good education unless they're interested in working hard and engaging at the curriculum. Three, does the institution provide an atmosphere that fosters true academic engagement? it might be unfair to expect universities to graduate their student athletes at a rate higher than their standard students graduate. But if those students are truly generating revenue and they're contributing in significant ways, I think it's our responsibility, not only as an academic services unit, but coaching staffs, faculty members, to make sure that we are providing an atmosphere where we're prioritizing the academic development. Obviously, athletics are important and they need to have time to contribute. But if there's not good balance in their life, and if there's not a consistent message that says students need to prioritize their academic growth and development, it's going to be very difficult for these students to balance the rigors of all their responsibilities in a meaningful way. I think these are good questions to look at. I don't think there's an easy answer to this. But more than anything, we need to ensure that we're not just meeting minimum metrics, that we are really, truly educating these young men and women in a substantive way that will allow them to use their time at university in a way that will develop them to be successful when their time with athletics come to an end. I think that's a good overview of the academic engagement questions, and I'm going to pass this off to Jill Bodensteiner.
Great. Big thanks to Adam, not just for his remarks today, but for what he does for our student athletes on a regular basis. If you're thinking to yourselves, wow, Notre Dame has a pretty good academic counseling system in place for your student athletes, you're absolutely right. We're among the models in the country of how to do it, and it's Adam and his colleagues and the folks in our writing center and the academic deans in the various colleges who do incredible work to make sure that our student athletes are engaged. So thank you to Adam and his colleagues all throughout campus for helping us do it the right way. I'm here to talk a little bit about the legal issues, and I'm going to frame it. There's sort of a big three legal issues going on in intercollegiate athletics right now. And I'm sort of framing them by their commonly used terms here. So unionization, our student athletes employees under the National Labor Relations Act. The second one is the scholarship rules of the NCAA are under attack, and the legal issue there is, do the NCAA rules on scholarships violate antitrust laws? And then third, the O'Bannon case, which has to do with essentially the name, image, and likeness of student athletes. And the specific legal question in O'Bannon is, do NCAA rules regarding amateurism violate antitrust and publicity rights of student athletes? So I'm going to go through each of these, starting with unionization. Provide a little bit of an overview, and I'm not going to answer many questions. I'm more giving it sort of a factual overview and throw out a couple questions, and then perhaps in the Q&A we can address some more directly. So brief overview of the union issue. This started, as most of you probably know, with Northwestern student athletes. Interesting, it's football only, and within the football squad it's scholarship only. So football is allotted 85 scholarships, so it's those 85 scholarship student athletes who are the proposed union members. The Northwestern student athletes are working with CAPA, College Athletes Players Association, who in turn is working with the United Steelworkers, receiving funding and advice from the steelworkers, and they're exploring the formation of a union of student athletes. And the legal question, as I stated, is, are student athletes employees under the National Labor Relations Act? And really the key question so far has been debated is the relationship between university and student athlete. In this case, football student athlete, is it educational or economical? So a brief little history of what's happened in Northwestern. In March of this year, the National Labor Relations Board regional director issued a ruling deciding that student athletes are employees under the NLRA and are therefore entitled to form a union for collective bargaining purposes. In April of this year, the National Labor Relations Board granted Northwestern their request for review of the regional director's decision. The very next day, the football student athletes held an election. There was a union election, and their ballots are sealed pending the NLRB review. On July 3rd, just this past week, there were 21 amicus briefs filed, and including one by the University of Notre Dame in conjunction with Boston College and BYU. Citing, I guess, the shorthand with Northwestern, but really talking about the issue of whether or not student athletes are employees, and specifically whether there's educational value to the intercollegiate athletics system. So briefing will be completed at the end of the month, and hopefully expecting a ruling sometime shortly thereafter. So I think one of the things that I want to make clear is I'm not sure that the Northwestern student athletes went into this with the primary issue being that we want to be called employees. I think it's much deeper than that. I think their issues are actually issues that are on the table for NCAA legislation consideration. So the big issues are things such as medical care. There's obviously been a huge sort of side issue in the NFL and college athletics with concussions. So medical care for current student athletes and former student athletes. Tuition availability for former student athletes who want to come back and finish their degree has been an issue. Multi-year grant and aid. So this whole concept of under NCAA rules, technically, you can sign a student athlete to a one-year agreement and not renew it for any reason, including that they fail to perform or suffer an injury. Now, different institutions have different rules on that, such that at Notre Dame, our faculty board on athletics does not allow us to non-renew, nor would we want to non-renew based on performance on the field or injury. But again, the NCAA rules on this are all permissive, so this creates a huge gap in the way institutions handle these things that I've just mentioned: multi-year grant and aids, medical care for student athletes, and tuition for former student athletes. So I think that's really at the core of what the Northwestern student athletes are seeking, and a voice, frankly, a voice in what goes on. You know, and NCAA gets blamed for a lot of bad rules, but at the end of the day, the NCAA member institutions are passing those rules, not the NCAA staff. And so what I think what the Northwestern student athletes are saying is we'd like a voice in the system that's passing these rules. So what can we expect when we get the decision from the National Labor Relations Board? I don't know that answer. I don't know where they're going to side, but I know some of the issues that are certainly on our minds on campus. I mean, generally, what is the impact of student athlete unions on campus if this happens? And what does that mean for grievances? What does it mean for compensation? What does it mean for, you know, topics of collective bargaining? What's an appropriate bargaining unit? So, you know, those of you who are labor law experts know that there's a bit of a dispute usually between the employer and the employees on what the appropriate collective bargaining unit looks like. In Northwestern, as I mentioned, they chose scholarship football student athletes. What about the non-scholarship football student athletes who are putting in the exact same time and have really the exact same day-to-day life in many ways? What about the fencer who is on scholarship? So I think that'll be a very interesting issue if this plays out. If student athletes are deemed to be employees under the National Labor Relations Act, what does that mean for tax laws? What does that mean for workers' compensation? What does that mean for the Fair Labor Standards Act, which governs minimum wage and overtime in the United States? And finally, this would be a bit of an overturn of previous NLRB. In 2004, they held that graduate and other sort of student teaching roles were not employees under the NLRA. So what would the impact on Brown be, and what does that do for RAs and GAs, graduate assistants and teaching assistants at colleges and universities? So, so a lot at stake, and I think, you know, if the NLRB sides with the student athletes and deems that they can be employees and can collectively bargain, I think the general sense is that it will change the way intercollegiate athletics certainly is run on the day-to-day basis, but that it would not mean the demise of college athletics as we know it. So that's a brief summary. Unionization, real quick thought to end on. I think part and parcel of the regional director's decision in the Northwestern case goes back to really what Adam was talking about. And the core question of, is athletic participation in and of itself part of the education? They seem to decide that an activity of a student athlete was either educational or economical. And our point of view here at Notre Dame is that being a student athlete is really part and parcel to your educational and academic engagement. I work very closely with the women's basketball team, and I have to think that a vast majority of skills that our student athletes, that those women bring to the workforce, are skills that they gained through working with Coach McGraw, as well as with tremendous faculty in the classroom. But I really see the growth in our student athletes because of their athletic participation. So I think that there's a bit of a fundamental issue at stake in the union case. Moving on to what I've sort of summarized as scholarship rules, and this one in many ways is the most interesting and the most scary to me personally. So a brief background, NCAA rules define what an athletics grant and aid can include, and it's limited to tuition, room and board, fees, and books. It does not include the miscellaneous or personal expense allowance that most institutions include along with those 4 items to reach the total cost of attendance. The NCAA and the federal government, however, do allow student athletes to keep their Pell Grants if eligible, and funds received from a fund called the Student Assistance Fund, which I've shorthanded as SAF here. SAF is a fund that it comes from the NCAA profits, essentially, and is redistributed to institutions. So Notre Dame gets $500,000 per year of SAF, and we use that to get that cash in the hands or resources in the hands of our neediest student athletes. So I put this into a nice little chart for you. So a non-student athlete on my left are if you were packaging, so to speak, in the financial aid world, a non-student athlete, you would give them tuition, room and board, fees, books, and a miscellaneous or personal expense allowance up to the cost, and that equals your cost of attendance. Student athletes are packaged differently because the NCAA does not allow one to include the miscellaneous personal expense in the grant and aid. So student athlete gets tuition, room and board, fees, and books. That equals their total grant and aid. And then they can accept the Pell Grant, which can be up to $5,700 a year in discretionary cash, and the student assistance funds on top of their full grant and aid. So in many cases, for our neediest students, what they get from the total package on the right greatly exceeds the cost of attendance on the left, which is a little known public fact when you read stories about the fact that because student athletes can't get the item in red, they can't afford food and other basics. So in short, there are multiple lawsuits filed against the NCAA and the, quote, power conferences alleging that these grant and aid rules that I just set forth violate antitrust laws. Last month, the cases were combined, and they're in the Northern District of California. The plaintiffs are Division I men's basketball and FBS football student athletes, and they're seeking a combination. The lawsuits vary a little bit, but money damages and injunctive relief. Injunctive relief would be essentially a court saying the NCAA rules need to be basically stopped because they violate antitrust. So, you know, what is at stake here? I think a lot, frankly. Would the rules be changed? Would they be mandated changes such that you have to give student athletes up to the cost of attendance, as I had in that left box? Or would it be wide open, such that you're allowed to pay, and you have to be allowed to pay under antitrust law, student athletes open market? So you'd basically have a salary cap model. If Notre Dame is spending $15 million on athletics aid a year, we now have a salary cap where each, athletic director decides how much money each team gets and each coach has to spend. And then if you really want a quarterback and you can pay them $1 million and Clemson's offering them, $5 million, then that's what it could potentially look like. And in that case, what happens to the Olympic sports? I think that's the biggest fear of the people in the industry. If we get to an open market on the so-called revenue sports, what happens to the swimmings and golfs and soccers and other sports? So there's a lot at stake with the scholarship cases that are now pending out in California. Last but not least is the O'Bannon case. Ed O'Bannon, former basketball player for UCLA. There were 2 cases, O'Bannon and then Sam Keller, a former quarterback at Nebraska and Arizona State. Both filed lawsuits, very long and complex history, but the long and short of both of them is that they're challenging the NCAA's amateurism rules. So the NCAA says only amateurs are allowed to participate in NCAA sports. So if you've received, prospective or current student athlete who's accepted any money based on their athletic skill, other than the athletic grant and aid and other permissible expenses, have violated the amateurism rules and are not eligible to participate. So the lawsuit originally involved the NCAA, the Collegiate Licensing Committee, and EA Sports. And again, really based on the use and restrictions of the use of student athlete name, image, and likenesses. The CLC, the EA Sports, and now the NCAA have settled what they call the video game portion of the lawsuit. So I think there's $60 million available now in settlement funds to distribute to former and potentially current student athletes as a result of the video game legislation. But the main case, the O'Bannon case, sort of morphed into the use of these name, image, and likeness in broadcasts. And so again, the ultimate question is, should prospective, current, and former student athletes be allowed to negotiate for use of their own name, image, and likeness in exchange for money? So the O'Bannon case went to trial, and it recently concluded out in California. It was a bench trial. Post-trial briefs are submitted yesterday, and a decision by the judge is expected early to mid-August. Appeals are imminent by either party, and certainly the NCAA will seek a stay of the injunction to continue to enforce its amateurism rules pending any ultimate outcome of the O'Bannon case. So, you know, the questions here, these are really, really significant legal questions to the current structure of NCAA intercollegiate athletics. And, you know, colleges and universities are not just sitting tight waiting for these to resolve. There's a lot of activity in motion on campuses and at the NCAA governance level. I mentioned in pretty great length some of the issues that the Northwestern student athletes are concerned about, and I think it's safe to say that looking at and perhaps changing the governance system of the NCAA will allow member institutions to pass rules that will meet many of the concerns of the student athletes. So with that, I know that was a very quick overview of three really complex legal issues, but I will close it and pass it on to Brian Levey, my esteemed colleague and neighbor, for a discussion of the ethics issues, and look forward to questions.
All right, well, thanks, and my thanks especially to Adam and Jill. If it's not obvious, they are very good at what they do, and they've helped me on a personal note get smart on these issues, and so I'm very grateful to them and grateful to the Alumni Association for hosting us. Let's talk ethics, and let's start with a definition, which is pretty basic, but will become important here in a minute. So what is ethics? A subfield of philosophy. The goal is to clarify the nature of right and wrong or good and bad. It tells us how we ought to behave, and at the risk of perhaps stating the obvious, just because something is legal doesn't make it right. So let's talk about compensation. The elephant in the room seems to be money, and especially compensating student athletes, and there's been a variety of proposals. Jill has alluded to some of these. Some of the proposals include paying a stipend of $2,000 or $3,000 to cover the true cost of attendance. Some kind of market-based compensation, maybe with a cap, some kind of payments or royalties or licensing fees for the use of the student-athlete's name or image or likeness, or enabling that student-athlete to sell an autograph for money. And what I thought might be interesting would be to break this down or run the issue of compensation through these ethical paradigms that we use in our ethics classes at the Mendoza College of Business. So when we look at an ethical dilemma, oftentimes there's the dilemma in the center, and we look at it through four different lenses or ethical schools of thought or ethical paradigms: egoism, utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And the idea here is that by looking at the dilemma from all different sides, we'll get a well-rounded, well-reasoned decision and help us avoid ethical blind spots. So first, egoism. What's this about? It's all about me, right? We ought to behave in our own self-interest. We only have one duty, and that is to ourselves. We should sometimes do things for others, but only when it's in our own self-interest. Advocates include Ayn Rand. Maybe some of you read The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged along the way. And in our ethics classes at Mendoza, we tend to look negatively on egoism. And in particular, I teach a ethics and accounting class. And you know, your ultimate duty as a CPA is to the public. And we study the financial crisis, the subprime meltdown, and what we see is, in the financial crisis of 2008, almost every participant in the process, everyone from home buyers to realtors to home builders to mortgage brokers to lenders to investment bankers, everyone acted in their own self-interest, and we had the financial crisis as a result. Having said that, if you are a fan of free markets or individual liberties, there are aspects of egoism that might appeal to you, and the challenge is drawing the line between what we look at as some all-American virtues and where we cross the line into avarice, right? Insatiable greed for riches, market failures, monopoly power, insider trading, that sort of thing. Where's the line? All right, utilitarianism. What's the story here? Well, the goal is to maximize, as the name implies, utility. So what do? You do a cost-benefit analysis, and the best alternative is the one that produces the greatest good. Advocates include Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Mr. Spock, who famously said, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few." Deontology, what's this all about? Well, it comes to us from Immanuel Kant, and it focuses on obligations or duties and rights of individuals rather than consequences. And so what would Immanuel Kant do? He would come to a dilemma and he would say, I should always act in a way such that my action should become a universal law, or stated somewhat differently, he would propose a course of action and say, what if everyone acted this way? And if the answer was, gee, I'd like everyone to act this way, that's how he or everyone else should act in that situation. An example might be the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And somewhat related is this notion that we're not going to treat individuals as a means to an end, rather we're going to treat them as an end in and of themselves. And then finally, virtue ethics comes to us from our old friend Aristotle. I guess he used to sit around in ancient Greece and ask questions like, what is the good life and how can I live it? And he answered it, at least in part, by saying a life without virtue is an unhappy life. So he came up with some virtues: prudence, courage, temperance, justice. Christians add some others that we're very fond of here at Notre Dame: faith, hope, charity. And I think sort of across religions, across cultures, people of goodwill have come up with some others: honesty, compassion, kindness. The list goes on and on. And what we tend to do in our ethics classes is bake these paradigms or schools of thought or lenses into a decision-making model. You know, determine the facts: who, what, when, where, why, how. What's the issue? Are we talking about a conflict of interest? What are the principles, rules, and values that come to play? What are the alternatives? What are my choices? You compare the values and the alternatives. You decide what the consequences would be, and then you make the decision. And I think a challenge for our undergrads, especially our sophomores in our introduction to business ethics, they want to pour all the facts into the ethical decision-making machine and have the answer pop out. And it doesn't really work that way. There's a reason. It's a dilemma. And oftentimes you have values that are in conflict, or you have values that you want to advance, and there's bad consequences. You're for academic integrity. You want to be loyal to your friend, but your friend cheated and you feel like you need to turn him in. Well, that's going to have some bad consequences for your friendship and for your friend. That's the dilemma. So again, the elephant in the room here is money. So why not go to really the poster boy for this, Johnny Manziel? At first I hesitated to sort of use an individual, but you can't not talk about him, and he's a pro now, so I felt a little bit better about it. So let's walk through his situation and look at these ethical paradigms. So first, egoism. He might ask himself, is it in my best interest to get paid? Yeah. And so I would very much like to sell my services, name, image, and likeness to the highest bidder. Pretty straightforward. And if you look at Time magazine, this is an article about 10 months ago. They said if college football players had revenue sharing agreements comparable to the NFL and NBA, Johnny's cut would have been about $225,000. Not too shabby. All right, utilitarianism. What might Johnny say? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. I should do a cost-benefit analysis to decide what does the most good for the most people. So what might he decide under this model? I'm going to forego personal compensation beyond a scholarship for the good of student athletes in non-revenue producing sports. This is the foundation of the NCAA's business model. And it's been a fabulously successful business model that's done a ton of social good. Here's a quote from Bubba Cunningham, who's the AD at North Carolina, and some of you might recognize him as a fellow Domer. The NCAA scholarships that students have been awarded for the past 50 years are the best scholarship program ever created, with the possible exception of the GI Bill. While they're not perfect, sports scholarships certainly provide great opportunities for an awful lot of students. And if you go to the NCAA's website, you see the good that this business model generates. NCAA member colleges and universities awarded $2.7 billion in athletic scholarships to over 150,000 student athletes each year. 15% of Division I student athletes are first-generation college students, so tremendous social upward mobility. 82% of Division I student athletes are earning their degrees, a rate higher than college students in general. And I think maybe a lot of us here today are certainly the folks on the panel, all graduates of Notre Dame, and we have this kind of skewed notion of graduation rates that it's in the 90th percentile. That's not generally true as college populations go in general. So 82% is a pretty high percentage and much higher than those entering college as a general population. All right, deontology. What might Johnny say? I should act in a way that I would want everyone else to act, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If I were a swimmer, I sure would appreciate football players foregoing compensation to help my sport. But I think there's this nagging issue here. He might say to himself, but people should not be used as a means to an end. And I sometimes feel like the NCAA, SEC, and Texas A&M are treating me like a means to an end. And again, this is from a Newsweek article from last fall, and it breaks down sort of the billboard that is Johnny Manziel. And if you look at it closely, and I added some circles here on the Adidas logos. You've got $37 million, the value of to Texas A&M's brand through broadcasting rights. $64 was how much his jersey was going for. $127 is how much a signed mini helmet was going for. Tickets, everybody made out on tickets from Texas A&M to the resellers to the scalpers. The head coach got a big raise. And $72 million estimated retail value of all Texas A&M branded merchandise sold in 2012, 2013, a 20% jump. The New York Times reports that donations were up from $300 million to $740 million following Johnny's Heisman run. Okay, and I put together, and this is admittedly a somewhat rough and crude compensation comparison, but I think it's interesting. You've got the the hypothetical Texas A&M football player, and to personalize it a little bit, let's say it is Johnny Manziel. He's an amateur, and he's got a scholarship worth $40,000. Now, you could argue it's worth a lot more than that when you get into the coaching, the academic services that Adam pointed out, training table, branding. You can easily get to a number as high as $120,000. You look at the governor of Texas, he's a public servant, pretty big job. He makes $150,000. And then you get over here to this right-hand column, and you get to some pretty big numbers. And I have public servant in question marks after their names, and their compensation seems to be set by the marketplace. And I don't begrudge them, this compensation. They are undoubtedly people of goodwill who have worked very hard. But to the extent they are arguing for the current system, they're in the unenviable position of arguing that's what's sauce for the goose is not sauce for the gander, right? They're selling their services to the highest bidder, and they're arguing that student athletes shouldn't, and that's a somewhat awkward position to be in. Virtue ethics, what might Johnny say? What would be charitable, compassionate, and the generous thing to do? Foregoing compensation for the good of student athletes in non-revenue producing sports, consistent with the virtues of amateurism. But is that fair? Is that just? Right? You go back to this slide. Is it fair? And so the challenge here, I think, is back to this ethical decision-making model. You've got some conflicting principles, rules, and values, and all within that category there are some conflicts, and then we have some consequences that maybe we don't like. We want people to be compensated for their effort, but we've had a system that relies on some people foregoing the fruits of their labors for the benefit of the whole. And it's been an incredibly successful system. So with that, I think the ethical paradigms help us facilitate a well-rounded, well-reasoned decision, and this is what leaves our students, I think, wanting. The paradigms and the ethical decision-making models, they don't definitively resolve the dilemma, and so we are where we are, right? You have people of goodwill, reasonable people who will differ, and what I tell the students at this point in time is, these are the issues. This is how it shakes out. Now, if you're the decision maker, you've got to make the tough decision. You've got to choose. And so with that, I guess we'll turn it over for questions.
Thanks, Brian. For those of you who are joining us live, please remember to submit your questions now try to get to as many of them as we can. You can submit your questions using the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Let's start out with, we have a question here from Bill Werner. Adam, I think this one looks like it's right up your alley. What is the nature of the tutoring provided to student athletes at Notre Dame?
Yeah. Through our office, all student athletes have access to content tutoring. The tutoring resources are designed to help students maximize their understanding of the material, right? One of the important things to distinguish about tutoring is that it is only one of the resources that are available to students. Obviously, we want the students to primarily engage with their faculty members as a great resource, office hours, right, to connect with those faculty members and ask substantive questions. In addition, they should be collaborating with their peers. One of the great things about coming to a place like Notre Dame is that you're surrounded by very capable, very engaged students, and it's important to collaborate. After they've been in class, after they've worked with their professors, after they've tried the material on their own, having content tutor access can be a great way to not only maximize their understanding, but to work efficiently. So it is something that we provide throughout the 4-year experience here. And it is unlimited in essence, as long as they're doing their part of attending class and taking advantage of the other resources. It's certainly something that is one component of what we provide. In addition to a tutoring service, we also provide a mentoring service, which is primarily used during the transition from high school to college. And that is during a structured study routine that we call the transition program, where you have mentors who are upper class students or graduate students that might work more closely in a one-on-one fashion to help with the process of being a college student, time management, organization, all the nuances that students will get ever better at the longer they're here. We'll try and accelerate to facilitate that transition and to help students work efficiently. But again, content tutoring is important, but it's only one part of a routine that we encourage students to take ownership of.
Great. Jill, we have a question that I think is more in your department, which is, which of the 3 legal issues that you cited that are currently kind of the basis for the legal challenges of the current system, unionization, scholarships, and then the O'Bannon case with the issue of using student athletes' likenesses, which of those challenges is the most likely to lead to significant changes in intercollegiate athletics?
My opinion is without a doubt the scholarship rules. Again, going to an open market, depending on what the decision was. If the decision is that we need to include up the cost of attendance or some sort of limited version thereof, I think that would actually roll out fairly easily. If it becomes a broad-based open market and pay as much as you want, and recruiting becomes literally you've got $10 million to spend in this sport, $500,000 in this sport, I think that would fundamentally change the nature of college athletics in a very real way, and create a dilemma for many institutions of whether they still want to be in the game, so to speak.
Sure, and as you kind of alluded, that would be, seems like that would have a lot of complications for Olympic sports if because the revenue, if more money was being allocated to revenue sports. So there's obviously some inequality there, but also if you were on a salary cap system, it seems logical that even in a sport like football, where you have 85 players, scholarship players on a roster, a coach could choose to spend a huge percentage of his budget on a star quarterback, a 5-star quarterback, and then that could have negative implications for currently, let's say 3-star prospects or less glamorous positions who are on full scholarship. It seems like it could damage the other. It's not just about the Olympic sports, but also in revenue sports, it could hurt student athletes moving forward in terms of their ability to get full scholarships. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think that may be accurate, although some of Brian's ethical dilemmas would say, well, that happens in the NFL all the time, right? It's a market, and if you're an offensive lineman, you're in the bottom of the market, or however it might play out. So I do think there would certainly be implications. The thing that I guess I'm most worried about is, in this big picture, is how the legal issues I described in general play out with Adam's very articulated concerns about academic engagement. Mm-hmm. So when our women's basketball players end their eligibility, their lives change completely. They get an agent, Nike's calling, Adidas is calling, they're preparing for the WNBA draft, they're working on their bodies, their places to live, insurance, their lives become totally different. And what we're saying is, if this becomes an open market, every student athlete's going to have an agent while they're a student athlete. They've got union issues to take care of, potentially. They've got their own name, image, and likeness to be negotiating. How in the world, with however much time we're expecting them to play their sport, are they going to academically engage? And, you know, ask Adam where our academic engagement of student athletes goes when they do end their eligibility and get an agent. And they're other focused at that point. And, you know, most of them are a week away from getting their degree, and that's okay. But if you add that element to junior year in high school, I just think it's a very interesting. I think Adam's world would become much more difficult. So I would say sort of globally, I'm concerned about all three challenges for that very reason. Not because I'm morally or ethically think we're doing or not doing the right or wrong thing. I just really worry about the fundamental nature of the student athlete in any of those three scenarios.
Sure. Brian, we have a question here from Kathleen Heidi. She asks, using the ethical paradigms that you articulated, how would a university and or the NCAA evaluate their ethical obligations vis-a-vis the legal questions raised by Jill? In other words, is it ethical to employ rules that deny athletes the ability to supplement their scholarships?
Well, I think they've taken that position. I mean, you know, you look at it's sort of a collectivist utilitarian system, and at the risk of putting the words in the NCAA's mouth or college presidents, I think the current system we have says the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, there's been a tremendous social good that's come through the current model. I think the issue recently is the dollars are so big, and the adults in the room that are making the decision, they're selling their services to the highest bidder, and I think that creates a challenge, a dilemma. But you know, there certainly there is a tremendous good, and depending on your point of view, nothing unethical about the current system.
Reminder to those of you joining us live, you can submit your questions now using the Q&A panel, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Adam, we have a few more questions here that apply to your work. One is from Ted Kubala, who asks, what would, if we're able to measure it, what would be the free market value of 4 or 5 years of tutoring that the student athletes get?
You know, it depends on how many hours they work and how much they take advantage of it. I don't know how to quantify that at this point, but I would say this in terms of quantifying the education as compensation, if I can run with it a little bit. The easiest way to ensure there's equity in this experience, and what I mean by equity is that, let's say for the revenue producing sports, that for those athletes that are generating revenue, into the current model that we have, how can we ensure that they're getting something of fair value in exchange? Is to ensure that they are receiving a truly transformative educational experience, that they're not, you know, remaining eligible, that they're not even getting a degree if that degree doesn't represent an experience that has really allowed them to grow and to develop a sense of independence and the ability to leave college and transition into the professional world when their sport's done. If we're doing that, if we're demanding of them engagement in a way that you know, using tutors and going to class and completing assignments that have true rigor, then what we're providing them is an experience that will empower them for the rest of their life. And that's what colleges are supposed to do. I mean, that's the whole idea of this, and that's where these student athletes are. So as much as we can talk about compensation in the form of payment or other ways of compensating student athletes that are very complex to implement at this point, I would promote, let's do what we're charged to do at these institutions, and that is really make sure these students are receiving a great education. If that's happening, then I would say that there's compensation.
And you mentioned during your presentation earlier that sometimes the APR system doesn't incentivize that as much as it incentivizes maintaining eligibility and things like that. And Mark Huckman asks, how could the APR be redefined or modified to improve universities' educational successes?
I don't know if the APR, I mean, you could always up the ante. You could always say that instead of, passing, X hours, you have to pass an increased number of those hours. This needs to be really about each individual institution making a commitment to ensuring that what they provide has integrity and has rigor. I mean, I think that's what we're looking at, is let's make sure that we're doing what we've promised these students, and that is to provide them with an experience that will empower them. The APR, I would say, if you really wanted to make this about getting an education, then you would increase the minimum requirements. Notre Dame is a place that we choose not to use the minimum. We have our own measure as to what is eligibility. We have a system in place that you could complete 15 credit hours in a semester, get C minuses in all your classes, have a 1.67 GPA, and you're ineligible, right? You completed 15 hours of credits, but you're still ineligible. And there's a reason, I think, that we're graduating at a high level, and that is because our baseline expectation is greater than what the APR is. That's a good thing.
Sure. And we have another question here from David Heskin, who asks if Notre Dame has done research among student athletes on how they feel about pay for play issues, and if that changes focus at all at the university.
I'll take that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Oh, in fact, I know we haven't done formal research. We certainly have engaged in informal discussions. And it's, I think feelings are across the board. You hear often also from former student athletes who are sometimes in a better position or a good position to reflect back. So we've certainly had those conversations. Does it inform us? I think one thing at the micro level, absolutely. It's, we've made some decisions and we've made some changes, and we're really working on, I think we have one of the best SAC programs in the country, which is the Student Athlete Advisory Committee, but we're really working on finding new and better ways to make sure the student athlete voice is a really important part of what we do in all these decisions that we make.
Great. Again, a reminder to those of you joining us online, submit your questions now in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Another question here, are NCAA member institutions, different universities and colleges, taking any action, or what actions are they taking to prepare for the various outcomes or scenarios laid out, posed by these legal challenges?
I think like us, institutions are looking at ways of incorporating student athlete voice in meaningful ways. The NCAA governance model itself that's under review is really focusing on finding a way to add the student athlete voice. And a note on the governance. So one of the primary problems, or at least situations here that's developed, is there are 350 Division I institutions, and among those, the interests and the finances are incredibly varied. And so the legislation, some of the concerns of the Northwestern student athletes, as an example, get hung up because the 350 Division I institutions can't agree. So what's happening right now with the NCAA governance model is looking at whether the 65 institutions that make up the so-called power conferences, the Big Five, should sort of pull out from the other 350, so that hopefully we can get some legislation passed that will, in fact, directly and tangibly assist student athletes in various ways. So one of the things that folks on campus are spending a lot of time on is the NCAA governance model. Many institutions, you may have read about some of the folks who have decided not to sell jerseys with any number of a current student athlete. So what's Johnny? Was he number 2?
Number 2.
So Texas A&M pulling all number 2 jerseys, and Johnny's senior year would be an example. I think Arizona, Northwestern have publicly announced that they're going to be selling only a jersey with 14 or 15, signifying the year, as opposed to a particular player. Certainly institutions are relooking at their there are agreements with various parties and the way we do things like jerseys, and are we taking care of our former student athletes? If we're going to sell anything with a, sort of historical Joe Montana or whatever it is, are we working with that former players, representatives to ensure that the money and the permission and all those things are squared away. So those are some of the things that are happening on campus. We're actually very closely looking at the grant and aid model that I shared, and sort of how would this cost of attendance idea play out in a meaningful way. One of the biggest sort of logistical dilemmas within an athletic department is that all of this is focused on men's basketball and football. And how does women's basketball, hockey, baseball, women's golf, women's swimming, women's soccer, men's lacrosse, how does this all fit into the big picture? And that becomes really tricky. So with this whole lens on, we're really looking at how you take these three challenges and see how they're going to apply to all 26 of our varsity sports and all 720 intercollegiate student athletes.
And then if I could add, you see the NCAA trying to make changes itself. I mean, it was the NCAA president, I think, who advocated the stipend about a year ago of $2,000, and was defeated, I think, because of the financial issues that Jill talked about. You have all these member institutions, and they have different financial profiles. So that got shut down. But then you see individual schools, again, as Jill mentioned, try to make changes. So sort of, guaranteeing the four-year scholarship in a way that they hadn't in the past, but Notre Dame always has done. So you see sort of incremental change collectively and then in individual cases. So change is coming, just not at the pace some would prefer.
Sure. One additional quick comment, Indiana University issued its own student athlete Bill of Rights a couple weeks ago. As an example of another sort of measure that some institutions are taking to get out ahead of it. And I am so, again, just have to take the opportunity to brag about my alma mater and my current employer as I look at the Bill of Rights that have been proposed federally and by various schools, and looking at them and saying, yep, we're doing that, and have been voluntarily doing that. And you hear from Adam about academic engagement. When multi-year scholarships came out, we jumped on them. Our faculty board does a tremendous job of making sure we're not cutting athletics aid due to the reasons I set forth earlier. We're providing significant help with medical expenses for student athletes in all sorts of arenas. So I feel great about where we are, but it's always an opportunity to look and make sure within the scope of the rules and the law that we're doing the right thing.
Sure. We've had a few questions come in about the admissions process for prospective student athletes. So one of the questions is, how does the admissions process differ for prospective student athletes versus other just general prospective students?
I think the easiest way to say it is that it doesn't. Not to speak for the admissions office, but I think it's safe to say that each applicant is evaluated as an individual. And the responsibility of the admissions office and what their goal is and what they aim to do is to identify individuals that will be good fits at the Notre Dame community. They want to look at what their backgrounds are, what their strengths are, what the diversity of their experiences are, and they aim to invite students that have the ability to be successful and that can come and contribute in many ways to our university community.
As opposed to some institutions, we don't have slots where Coach X gets 10 slots. Admissions is looking at each and every candidate in a holistic way, as Adam mentioned, and it's based on the big picture.
And as we talk about kind of doing things the right way, and you were kind of touting Notre Dame's success in a lot of these areas earlier, does it seem like kind of across all these issues and even APR are college sports in some ways handicapped by a lack of attention paid to the success stories like that, and or even awareness in the media and among fans of issues like APR, when I think the average college football fan probably doesn't know what APR is and may have never heard of it. A lot of Notre Dame fans maybe have because we score so high consistently, but is there an issue of maybe needing to raise awareness of these issues and shine a light more on the success stories, and could that kind of improve college athletics as a whole?
it might improve the perception. I'd like to think people are aware of how positive so many of the student athletes' experiences are. But the reality comes down to when you're looking at the smaller percentage, football, men's basketball, women's basketball, of stories that come out, whether you want to call it exploitation because revenue is being generated and there's not good or sufficient graduation rates, or there's integrity issues. I think that's always by nature going to dominate and it should in some level. You know what I mean? As much as you want to say, look, there's a lot of great things happening here, and promote that positive image, I think it's worth scrutinizing the areas where you need to improve. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, as much as you want to recognize how positive many dynamics are.
Sure. One more reminder for those of you joining us live, we're running a little bit short on time here, so if you have a question for our great panel here, please submit it now. Another question, Jill, about the legal challenges. You spoke about kind of some incremental changes like four-year scholarships and medical care and things like that can be made. And one question is it inevitable with all the legal challenges and the kind of amount of public pressure that the NCAA or college athletics is headed for kind of a large-scale upheaval of the system, or through these kind of smaller incremental reforms, is it possible that it will be more incremental and kind of avoid a huge upscale upheaval of the system?
I think there are several possibilities. I think one is an upheaval. I think one is that incremental change sort of does the trick, or that some of the things everyone's fearing don't have as large of a negative impact as some people are worried about. I think congressional intervention is a possibility. So I think, I wouldn't want to forecast which is more likely, but in some ways we're proceeding business as usual, hoping that the core of what we have as intercollegiate athletics will remain, at the same time being very aware of possible changes and incremental changes. And so I'm not sure. I think there's probably 3 or 4 solid options, each of which could happen in some measure. I think you also need to look at the bigger landscape. I mean, one question that I've really been spending a good deal of time with in my own mind is how much of all of this is because there's no viable developmental league in the NFL and or the NBA. How much of this entire problem would be solved? Why aren't we worried about hockey and baseball student athletes? Because they have options. If I'm 16 and want to go pro and get an agent and negotiate as a baseball player, I'm happy to do so because there's a phenomenal minor league. How much of this would, both ethically, from Brian's perspective, legally, certainly academically, how much of this would be resolved if you had student athletes who wanted to be here and who had a choice? And could literally say, you know what, we just turned the CFL into the developmental league of the NFL, forget college, I'm going there. I can negotiate, I can get paid. So I think there are a lot of sort of external factors that play into this as well that we can't be naive about.
Sure, and that's actually a question that just came up that I was going to pose to you, Brian, that someone asked, ethically, is it fair that if Johnny Football wants to be able to go after his senior year of high school or his freshman year of college to the NFL or to a minor league that the NFL could set up, why shouldn't he be able to? And would that kind of simplify the very complicated ethical calculus?
Well, so it does. We really haven't talked about the pro leagues. Ironically, what might solve some of these issues would be unionization and collective bargaining, because then we could make some collective decisions, or at least the players could on their own behalf. Ironically, the NFL and the NBA, through collective bargaining with the leagues, have made certain decisions about eligibility with respect to college players. So you've got the NFL effectively has a free minor league system, and you could say they're the one keeping Johnny down on the farm, not not the NCAA. And so they're certainly complicit in all this.
All right. And another question here. We have, at what point is the public focus, does does it, and we kind of touched on this earlier, but does the public focus on sports like football especially, and also basketball, does that harm, Olympic sports if all kind of the motivation around the public kind of discussion of these issues is focused on the two sort of most high-profile sports? Is that kind of ethically balanced and fair to the Olympic sports and the maybe smaller and non-revenue producing sports?
So that's why we're here, because and that's why this is a dilemma, because you have reasonable people disagreeing. So we have this sort of quaint, old-fashioned notion of college sports. I used to listen to Notre Dame on the Mutual Broadcasting Network, the radio network, with my dad in the backyard raking leaves, and Notre Dame could only be on national TV. I think it was 3 times every 2 years, and you have this this notion of young Bill Bradley sort of walking across the Princeton campus in his varsity Letterman sweater with his books on his way to becoming a Rhodes Scholar. And the world has changed, and I think what's changed are the dollars. The dollars are just staggering. And again, I'm sort of repeating myself, but the thing that makes this so pointed is the dollars that everyone else in the food chain, start with everybody working at Nike, ESPN, the NCAA commissioner, the conference commissioners, and the folks at the university. They are reaping the benefits in a market-based economy, and depending on your politics, you probably favor selling your services to the high. That's kind of the American way. You work hard and you sell your services to the highest bidder. Having said that, we do have this system that is it's not just steeped in nostalgia. It's steeped in a social good that so many have benefited from, and that's. I sound like the classic lawyer on the one hand and on the other hand, but that's the dilemma, and people fall on different sides.
Sure, and we've had a lot of discussion of value, and the value of the scholarship, let's say, in your one slide, and then you said that different factors could increase that, whether it be academic counseling or other benefits that student athletes are able to get by being at the university. But what about, and I know this is probably harder to measure, but is enough attention to pay to maybe even the most long-term value, which is over the course of your life, the value of the education if you earn a degree from a place like Notre Dame? Is enough attention to pay to that, and how do you kind of weigh that with alongside everything else?
Yeah, so if you go back to this slide, I can't remember my exact words, but I said this is a pretty crude and rough comparison. So some commentators had said, look at that 40,000. Well, again, okay, that's sort of the face value, if you will. Let's throw in the tutoring. Let's throw in the coaching. Let's throw in the training, the training table, the branding, the life skills, as you point out, the value of a college education and earning power over the course of a lifetime. And that gets to be a much bigger number, but you could make similar arguments to, on some of those other numbers, that there's some sort of collateral long-term branding experience benefits that go along with those other numbers. And again, we live in the society, we sell our services to the highest bidder, and in other sports, as Joe pointed out, we had what do we have, like a 12-year-old playing in the U.S. Women's Open golf championship?
Yeah.
Tennis, all these other sports, soccer. You can sell your services to the highest bidder at an early age, and while so many of us love the college sports model as it has existed, and for all of our lifetimes. There's something that leaves us a little bit uncomfortable with others in the system making huge sums, and I don't know if anybody else. I didn't tune in last fall to see Texas A&M. I tuned in to see Johnny Manziel. He was a once in a generation athlete, and I wanted to see what he was going to do. I didn't really care what the commissioner of the SEC was going to do. I didn't care what the president of Texas A&M was going to do. I tuned in to see Johnny Manziel, and thus the dilemma.
Sure. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I think we can all agree that this is a very fascinating and complex topic, and we wish we had another hour to discuss it, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thanks so much to our panelists, Brian, Jill, and Adam. It was great having you, and I know we all learned a lot, so thank you very much. Thanks to those of you who joined us live, and for those of you watching later on our YouTube channel. For future editions of ND Conversations and all of our online learning programming, you can go to my.nd.edu/online learning to stay up to date on our upcoming programs. And you can go to our YouTube channel, the Notre Dame Alumni Association YouTube channel, to watch past programs as well. I'm Kevin Brennan. Thanks so much for watching.